What's going on? It's Lack of Lepers, aka SCP and RCP. I eat crepes, TOS, all kind of stuff. Prey class, Jason Panopoulos, Minimal, Ghost Horses. The list goes on and on. I'm still yet other people that you don't know. I am on the SCP Wiki staff. You didn't know that. Anyway, we're going to pick up right where we left off. Dr. Gears. Let's hit this on 1.25. And I think we were about here. We're about 40 minutes in.
Right.
And but
well,
it's very funny.
Was that still like before you came to the Wikidot site?
There's that Hanna-Barbera
that was back
dog
before,
wheeze laugh.
The Wikidot site. If someone catches me on this, it was either before that or right when we came over. But I think it was before. I'm pretty sure it was before.
They're talking about the prototype. And I did send him a message showing him on an archived version of Edit This, his comment that says, basically, I'm Dr. Gears. Here's my SCP-001 prototype. So, will he respond? No.
And it was on the old site. I remember I wrote a bunch of stuff. Some of them being 682, and that's where 682 got its edit by the guy. White Guard referenced him in his text interview, which you haven't read. Go read that; it'd be very cool.
Yep.
Yeah. Link in the description.
There you go. But he went through and kind of edited and turned 682 from it was janky to begin with to sort of the lovable.
What was that guy's name?
Death Gecko that he is today. And I very much appreciate that. Read a couple other things as well. I want to say 914 was at that point too. I'm pretty sure.
Great
it was.
article.
It was a long time ago.
One of the best.
But either way,
914. Was it 914? Oh, please say 918.
SCP or something like that. That is very often.
It is 914, isn't it?
Dr. Gears, the prototype.
I didn't send Dr. Gears a message. Yeah, okay, good.
Right.
And but it's very funny.
God, I almost shit my pants
Was that still
there.
like before you came to the
It was a
Wikidot
real
site
anus
now?
clincher.
Yeah, that was back before the Wikidot site. If someone catches me,
Here we go. White Guard's
it was
interview with
either
Dr.
before
Gears.
that or right when we
What
came
was
over.
that dude's
But I think it
name?
was before. I'm pretty sure it was before.
It was before, my man.
And it was on. I wrote a bunch of stuff.
682. You're
some of the
searching his
682, and that's where 682
hard
got
to
its
destroy
edit
his
by the
White
guy.
Guard.
White Guard referenced him in his text interview, which you haven't read. Go read that; it'd be very cool.
Yeah. Link in the description.
There you go. But he went through and kind of edited and turned 682 from it was
Epic
janky
Fail Spy.
to begin with,
Yeah.
to sort of the lovable Death Gecko that he is.
Epic,
today. I very much
lovable Death Gecko. Epic Fail Spy was someone you can see a lot of on, how you say, Edit This, and really, I think we even saw him on SCP for a while. So that's just cool.
appreciate that. Read a couple other things as well. I want to say 914 was at that point too. I'm pretty sure it was. It was a long time ago.
914 is one of the best, obviously, but what I love about it so much, besides the fact that it was the second SCP I ever read, but the first one that really blew my mind. First one also by Dr. Gears 106, but the collaborative nature of those logs still goes on to this day. And, this is a good time to bring this out. There's something to be said for concepts that are simple. Because not every simple concept has a ton of creative fertility in it. Some concepts that are simple, you might call them thin, lend themselves to a dramatic array of creative offshoot and potential and growth. And really some of the oldest, most creative, lasting, varied things that we know of are a result of this. I mean, you can point to cultural products and exports like alcohol. Alcohol, every alcoholic beverage is basically a process of fermentation, which is the conversion of bacteria, the conversion by bacteria, of sugar to alcohol, essentially. And that's a very simple process, relatively speaking. And yet, that's really what is at the basis of everything alcoholic, beer, wine, spirits, whatever. And it would be a little short-sighted and a little, intellectually weak to think that the process of fermentation itself, because it is relatively conceptually simple or thin, it is therefore not very valuable. Or that it would be a good criticism to say that fermentation is conceptually thin, right? And this goes on for other things as well. SCP is a good example of it, where you have just a basic set of building blocks and a tremendous amount of variety, an infinite amount of variety, actually. And the same really is true for biology. You have basic building blocks of life, carbon structures, 4 nucleotides. That's it. And you really get all of life as a result of this essentially thin concept to start with. So it's funny. When you hear people like Quantum, who previously I still have respect for. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but who recently on his Twitter said the same criticism of something like the Backrooms. First of all, the amount of cognitive dissonance that you have to pave over in order to make that statement, being an SCP author, right? And I'm not bashing SCP. I mean, confic in general is pretty impressive, first of all. I think the criticism, just to derail, go on a tangent, I think the criticism came from a point of insecurity and creative defensiveness on the part of Quantum, which is unlike him. But so if just because something is, he's not wrong. It is, Backrooms is conceptually thin. That's not the rebuttal. The rebuttal is thinking that because something is conceptually thin, it doesn't have the capacity, the stamina, the creative chutzpah to produce a tremendous amount of creative value. And the same also could be said of 914. It's a very simple concept. You put something in, there's an input, there's an output, there's a black box in the middle, and there's gradations of tuning that comes with that. It's a very thin concept. That's it. But it still goes on to this day. That's why I think it's such a brilliant article. It's obviously very well written as well. And in addition to that, it really embodies, and sort of in a microcosm, the whole idea of collaborative fiction, where you make this one entry. If you read that thread of Quantum's, I'll put a link in the description just so you can laugh at this with me. But if you read the thread, the Twitter thread of his that says this, he goes on to say things like, so that all of Backrooms could just be an SCP. Okay, well, so you're telling me that all of that 914 experiment logs, it's a bad thing that those are all about one SCP? I mean, do you see how stupid this criticism is? I mean, you can really take one idea, one SCP, and blow it up into a universe. In fact, that's what we see a lot of authors doing these days with their lore that self-references. So it's just a remarkably dumb thing for Quantum to say. He did get a little bit of flack, maybe not in his Twitter threads and his ignorance bubbles and echo chambers that he doubtlessly is in, being a vivid SCP member, but he definitely got a lot of flack for it in other places that I frequent.
Either way, I forget my kids' birthdays too, so don't hold it against me. Whether
you got 4 kids, man. It's all right. Sheesh.
Sorry, there it is. Some SCP historian's gonna come back and be like, "You got that wrong." I'm like, "Yeah, you fucking."
Oh, that's me. That's me. I'm an SCP historian. Me, a Harmony, Salt Blossom, cool dude. Let's not forget that guy. Holy shit. He's mentioned all over the place in White Guard's interview with Dr. Gears. In fact, that's probably who he's thinking about. Cool guy is sort of the definitive, the archetypal archivist. He's the definitive historian for SCP. He does a fantastic job and has been quite valuable for the Confic Wiki. And I think really unintentionally we made a home for him there that he, I think, hopefully is quite comfortable with, because it's right up his alley, and he's incredibly talented at this sort of archaeology. He did the Holders article on Confic Wiki. He did the June 2018 Pride controversy article, which was no small feat. Nobody wanted to touch that one. And so, yeah, SCP historians, you could call it that. It's a little bigger in scope because we're dealing with confic, and we do dabble with proto SCP, so the holders, for example. But he's right. This is exactly what happened. I almost wish I would have listened a little further before writing him. I could have had fun referencing that.
So, yes, I did. I'm right there with you.
But he's right. He was right, by the way. He said that it was the SCP-001 prototype was posted on Edit This before the SCP Wiki, and he's right.
But I put together a lot of stuff in a lot of my early entries, and I was really cooking. I was actually kind of getting stuff together.
Oh, God, he was in the zone.
I was like
firing on all cylinders.
Sometimes 2 or 3 entries in a day. Like there was a period where I was doing like 2 or 3 entries a day for like a week.
I have a drinking problem.
Some period of time.
Crazy.
And you got to remember, one of the things being there was no structure. There was no anything. We had this very, very loose idea of how things ran, and like the general mythos. And otherwise, like anything you want to do, there was no. It's like, oh man, someone's already done that. No, they fucking didn't. There's nothing there. We're under 100 entries. Everything's on the table, so you just be like, ah.
I think this is in part why the fracturing of containment fiction to move past and beyond the containment cell and the containment procedures of SCP. What I mean is that it's inevitable, I think, in so many ways, that the genre that SCP created and developed was going to outgrow it and leave it. It's just like any kid who grows up in your house and then at some point is going, if you've done things successfully, is going to leave. And this shouldn't be, you shouldn't have a selfish reaction to that where you want to keep the kid cloistered in a state of arrested development just so that you can selfishly hoard that thing that you created and made suitable and fit for bigger and better things. And so I think that's what's happened. Unfortunately, I do think that's the way that SCP has reacted to the situation. But I think it was inevitable because what he's saying is that you have this new frontier wherein, basically it opens up new avenues and new dimensions of application of the format and the genre in ways that the SCP either won't let you do or has already done, or both. So, when you open up new avenues like this, when you take it and import it or export it, into other imports, it really bolsters the creative capacity of it. The capacitance is increased dramatically. I personally see this with my own rendition of the genre, which is the AOE format on my blog. And it's like trailblazing, or it's like nation building. It's like chartering to new lands and finding an abundance of new resources. There's just something conceptually about it that it can stifle you for a while. It can hold you back. And all these things, not just the content of the articles that came before you, but just all the things at SCP that you walk into the in progress status of. And let me pause here. I'm gonna do something a little different. We're about 13, 14 minutes in. We got a few more minutes. And I'm going to use this moment to harken back to something important that Dr. Gear said in the previous video. And that was that when you walk into a community that's already sort of pre-populated with figures and works and expectations and norms, you can sort of start to differentiate those things from yourself as an integral and equivalent part of that whole interaction and that whole culture. So I'm going to do something a little strange here. I've got a book right here. Great book. This is a book of poetry that I think you can still get. This is of a modern poet, Benjamin Caruth. Nobody knows about him. He was an acquaintance of mine. He's still alive. We just don't talk very much. But I want to read this passage. It's just a page. So, something curious occurs when we admire someone. This is a book of poetry, by the way. And he interlays prose that sort of plays off of the upcoming poem. So anyway, let me read this to you. Something curious occurs when we admire someone. Their failings fall away. Their foibles become signature quirks. Their pains mere peculiarities that shape their distinct genius. We make them avatars of the qualities for which we love them. We make them statutes. We make them out to be beings radically unlike ourselves. We make them statues. If we do this when we admire, how then can we see ourselves as admirable? Blind to our own brilliance and blind to the presence of the all too familiar compromise and cost of those abilities when present in other persons, it is tempting to characterize the brilliant as unlike ourselves. To do lend our unconscious habits the validation of declaration. This action serves another purpose, one more oriented towards ourselves than that on which we look. It prevents the questions that would be provoked by recognition of similarity, that the luminous are as blind to their light, blinded by their light, as we are by our own. If we recognized such things, we may question our self-portraits, wonder if we are as we think we are. Most would rather be certain of their misery than entertain ambiguities of joy. Our self-definitions hold mysterious power, being the vessels which we invest with all we consider precious and true. And so I think that really hits home on this point that Dr. Gears is trying to make about coming into something like the SCP and something we were talking about last time. It really ties into larger observations and, quite frankly, critiques of the SCP, where you have clique culture, you have cult of ego, cult of brand, these things that have set themselves up to be sort of the bullies of the space, just ideologically, when in fact they're paper tigers. You know, these people all shit, you know. Every one of the heroes that you want to set into a non-peer status and make into a statue, or those people who want to do that to themselves, DJ Cactus. These people were babies at one point, crying for their mother's tit. All right. These people shit. These people fart. They're humans, and to do that is such a unfortunately human habit, when in reality, it makes the person who's doing it and the person who's being elevated so less human. And I think that's what births a lot of negative behaviors that can start to turn a project like the SCP away from something more genuine and into something incredibly disingenuous. So I just want to mention that because I think he just said something to that extent again.
We're under 100 entries.
Yeah,
Everything.
and so my point is that once you escape those things, once you escape that mold, you can have new horizons open up to you. It's the same thing that happens when you fracture, split off of something like SCP and go in your own direction.
Things on the table. So you just be like, I'm going to make this, and just like throw shit out there. And it was, I'm going to make pipes that are alive and get into shit. And yeah, brother, do it. That was
that's crazy.
It was really, really cool. It was very, very Wild West. Of course,
exactly.
The downside of this was a lot of it was junk. Like, I hate to be that guy. But
so this is, I hate to pause so much. I'm sorry. I just have way too much to say. But the funny thing about this is that I know that, this video, if it ever gets a lot of attention, it's going to be like years down the road. So I just want you to say these things, not for like an audience sake, although I do hope you're listening. And I do appreciate you being here because I have a lot of fun doing this. But these things are stated for posterity. And for the simple fact that, we don't need the years that it's taken for these observations to be more widespread in the culture. These things were available to us the whole time. And the question is, why were they so available and yet so unrecognized by the larger SCP culture, for example? And that's its own discussion. But, this is why something like SCP's bullying, really, of something like RPC for its subpar quality, particularly as it got started, is so hypocritical. It's so inhumane, honestly, because in order to do that, in order to attain some more direction, some independence, some creative entrepreneurship, and go on and do something like that, you are necessarily giving up, pleasantries, qualities of life that are taken for granted at the place you just split from, right? That's why it's, you have to have a lot of audacity. You have to have a lot of bravery. You have to have a lot of ambition. You have to have a lot of, it's not for the faint of heart, okay, to do something like that. And so for SCP to just instantly magnetize its whole entire PR apparatus and magnetize its bully pulpits, its political mouthpieces, and megaphones to really attack something like the RPC for its, its lesser quality. It's younger than you. It's like making fun of a 5-year-old because they can't do algebra. It's really kind of a dick thing to do. And unfortunately, what it's really done is it's petrified the value and the representation of what containment fiction can become for those people in the SCP who are still in that mindset, stuck really in 2018. Because, these people haven't been paying attention. They've been underestimating RPC. The stuff at RPC is really, really good these days. It is meaningless to try to say that there is worse stuff at RPC on the whole. I think that you can say the range of article quality from bad, really bad, to really, really good is as wide on RPC as it is for SCP. You have instances of just as good of writing as you see on the SCP, and you have instances of just as bad writing as you see on the SCP. These things are not really that different. Certainly they're different in terms of quantity. And unfortunately, the SCP Wiki tends to sort of trapped in that mindset of quantitative metrics. This, by the way, is another contradiction of Quantum and his criticism of the backrooms, which is very popular and is generating a lot of attention. The backrooms right now is generating a lot of numbers. These YouTube videos that are coming out, for example, have like millions and millions and millions of views like in a week's time. And so someone like Quantum will buttress the fact that their concept for SCP really, when you boil it down, is just as conceptually thin as something like the backrooms, but they'll overlook that. That's what they use to pave over their cognitive dissonance, is the quantitative parts of it. We have this many more articles than you. We've been alive for this much longer than you. Look at all this stuff that we have, So, it's unfortunate when you have people who are stuck in these old mindsets and who can't progress. These people are literally, not literally, let me back up. They're rhetorically shooting themselves in the feet. They're slipping their head into their own noose without even knowing it. And that's a real shame. That's one of my primary goals, is to point this out to people. It's not to abandon the SCP or have it destroyed or whatever. It's just that we should be celebratory about the diversity and breadth to which confic is moving. And it's unfortunate that SCP on the whole does not agree. And I hate to say it, but one day they won't be laughing about it, and they're going to be left behind. So anyway, that's enough for one video. I'm going to do one more tonight. I hopefully won't talk as much. I'll try to be quiet. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.